Okay, so my name's David Brady. I'm a professor at Stanford, and I have absolutely no expertise in regard to wildlife fires or anything like that, but I think I can facilitate this so that's my role. So I'm going to introduce everybody in order. We're going to do the presentation in order. So the first speaker will be Alyssa Cordner, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology and Paul Garrett Fellow at Whitman College. She does research on environmental sociology, environmental health, and risk and disaster. Next is Rebecca Miller, who's a graduate student at Stanford in Environment and Resources. She was a Science Policy Fellow in Washington that coordinated with the White House Office of Science and Technology, and she does research on wildfire management. Our third speaker is John Giller of the U.S. Forest Service, who was recently appointed Director of Fire Management for the Northwest region. And our final speaker is Patrick Shea, who's a research professor of biology at the University of Utah. So the strategy will be each person will get 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. Iris, I'm looking at you. Is that okay? All right, so that's what we're going to do. All right, so we'll begin with Alyssa, you're up.
Great, thank you all. It's wonderful to be here with such a distinguished panel, so thank you all for putting this on. My research focuses on the sociological aspects of wildland fire risk management, in particular questions about how risk management policy is developed and how changes to those policies impact the public, impact issues of environmental inequality, and also impact the firefighters who are actually doing the work. Excuse me. I've conducted 3 years of mostly field-based ethnographic research, largely with fire crews and fire managers in Central Oregon. Thank you. And that has focused on a couple different aspects. One is actual on-the-ground firefighting with crews out of the Deschutes National Forest, also shadowing an incident management team as they respond to large fires around the Northwest. And as part of that was here in Yakima last week as part of the IMT meetings. And then also research with community groups, partners who are trying to reduce wildland fire risk at the local level, thinking about issues of public communication and public perception. And my work is predominantly focused on Central Oregon, even though I'm based in Southeast Washington. And there's some unique challenges, I should say, well, not unique. There's some challenges associated with wildland fire in Central Oregon that I think are particularly interesting. One is there's a very complex fire regime, everything from sage steppe ecosystems to mature ponderosa pine forests. Additionally, there's a very complex land ownership checkerboard where you have 79% of Deschutes County actually owned by the federal government, including Forest Service, BLM, and then also state and municipal county public lands as well. There's a lot of fire in Central Oregon, which makes it an interesting place to study wildland fire. The majority of their fires are lightning starts, but there are always a number of human starts as well. And Central Oregon, in particular the Bend region, where I was living for 3 fire seasons, they've seen a tremendous population explosion. In 1990, the Bend population was about 24,000. It's over 80,000 today. So in less than 30 years, the population has tripled. There's been a dramatic shift in the economy. And so now you have what the Visitors Bureau estimates at about 1.5 million tourists every summer coming into Bend. Many of these folks don't have a lot of experience with fire-adapted ecosystems and certainly don't come to Bend to experience a wildfire firsthand. So it makes for a challenging social environment as well. So I want to talk about 3 examples of social learning or learning from social factors. One that I think has been very successful, one that still is in progress, and one that perhaps needs a little bit more work. So first, looking at collaborative fire management, COFMIS is the Central Oregon Fire Management Service. And you can see here, this is that land ownership checkerboard I was talking about, where you have everything from wilderness areas, Forest Service land, BLM, and then private, state, and municipal land ownership as well. And there's also been a tremendous amount of fire activity. So this shows the green boundary is the COFMIS service boundary, and then all those red areas are fires that have happened between 1975 and 2015. So a tremendous amount of fire activity on this landscape. And in response to the land ownership checkerboard and to some communication and resource distribution challenges on fires in the 1990s, land managers came together and said, we're going to reinforce our service-first idea. Fire doesn't respect land ownership boundaries. The fire doesn't say, oh, I've come to BLM land, I'm going to turn around now. And so you really have to be working together and sharing resources as opposed to fighting over those resources. And so Central Oregon now has COFMIS, which is this very collaborative, and according to locals and according to folks around the region, very successful approach to initial attack fires where Forest Service and BLM resources are combined, and they respond to the fires regardless of land ownership. So a very successful example of social learning. A second example that perhaps still has some work, still needs some work, is around smoke management. These pictures are all from this past summer in or close to Bend, when there was a tremendous amount of smoke exposure and inversions related to all the wildfire activity. So smoke is a particular challenge when it comes to prescribed fire and getting permits and permissions from state DEQ and the Oregon Department of Forestry to do prescribed fire or controlled burns on public land. Wildfires are seen as something that's unpredictable, so we can't obviously issue a permit for the wildfire, but you do have to have a permit for smoke that would be released from a prescribed fire. And whenever there is an intrusion, whenever smoke comes into the community, you have to file a lot of paperwork. There might be fines associated with it. So it creates a real difficult policy landscape for fire managers to navigate, along with a social landscape that can be challenging. Prescribed fires do release smoke, and people talk about Bend as being, people described it to me as a perfect storm. So you have a demographically sensitive population called a sensitive smoke receptor area, largely because of how many older and retired folks have moved to Bend recently. So you have a lot of people with sensitive respiratory health issues. And then topographically and climatologically, whenever you're burning east or southeast of Bend, that smoke is going to flow right down the Deschutes River, right through the city of Bend. So there is a tremendous potential for smoke inversions. There's been a lot of work by the Forest Service and also by some collaborative community groups to build the social license to increase public acceptance of prescribed fires, which will release a small amount of smoke in the shoulder seasons in the fall or the spring, with the idea that this will reduce the risk of larger fires close to town during seasons like the summer, like August and September, that are prime tourist seasons, and at times when you can't control, you can't think about which direction the winds are moving, and you have less control over overall smoke exposure. So people have told me there has been a lot of progress in this area. Perhaps John has a take on this as well, but there's been progress on this idea that the DEQ is now willing to grant permits to COFMIS folks, even expecting that there might be an intrusion, even expecting that they will have to complete the paperwork, but people have told me they don't fine us anymore, so that's an improvement. And there's actually a big smoke management meeting with DEQ and ODF in Salem next week. Thank you. So some progress being made in this area that certainly has a lot of connections to improving health in the region as well. And then finally, an area where I think we haven't seen as much social learning is around issues of firefighter safety. So this is an image from the Twist River fatalities that killed 3 firefighters just north of here several years ago. And one of the largest shifts that we have seen, at least what I've seen coming through the Forest Service, has been a shift towards away from always seeing direct attack on a fire and full suppression as being the very first and preferable option. Instead, we're seeing some alternate strategies that might involve taking a fire out to a larger box, allowing more acres to burn, with the idea of doing some more landscape treatment and also reducing exposure to firefighters. But a few concerns around these types of approaches. One, they have only been implemented at a very limited basis. They're very costly, and they're really not seen as being an option in areas that have a lot of values at risk. And so if you are in a rural, WUI, wildland urban interface environment, such as the road where the Twist River fatalities occurred, this isn't an area where firefighters are going to be thinking about taking a fire out or not engaging in direct suppression. And at moments when fire behavior is potentially the most extreme, in those moments of initial attack, in the type 3 fire, at transition moments, for example, when we often see firefighter fatalities or injuries and entrapments, these also aren't moments when we're thinking about alternate strategies. And so there have been a lot of initiatives at the Forest Service in response to fatality events. The most recent was the Life First initiative, which people talked about as being largely a response to the Twist River fatalities. But folks, at least the firefighters on the ground, saw this as largely a policy intervention that had little to no relevance to their work on the ground. It was just about messaging from the top. And so thinking about how can the messages or how can the policies that might improve firefighter safety and health go beyond just a policy message towards some more meaningful change. Last summer, there was a fire on the Deschutes National Forest that involved a lightning-struck tree in the middle of a snag patch like this one. This is the very edge of that fire. This was in an old fire scar, and so when you have all these standing snags, there's a tremendously high risk to firefighters, their exposure to those falling trees. And what the fire management team decided to do after several local crews refused to go in and cut down those snags directly was to take this perhaps 10 by 10 fire out to 700 acres. And so they took it out to road systems that existed. They took it out to natural features. And as a consequence, this fire, which perhaps could have been extinguished by a couple of helicopter bucket drops, cost about $1.5 million, involved about 200 people working on the fire for several weeks. And so what I would argue is that this hasn't reduced the risk to firefighters, it's transferred the risk in some way. If we think of risk, the classic definition of risk as a function of exposure and hazard, these firefighters are dealing with a different type of hazard. They're not dealing with the burning snag falling on them, but they're dealing with working around heavy equipment. They're dealing with firing operations that can take several days. So this is a question of transfer of risk as well. I think there's a lot of complexity here and a lot of conversations that will likely still need to happen, but an avenue for future collaboration and growth. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the panelists.
Great. I'm going to be talking about wildfire trends and responsibility areas in California. I'm going to start by talking about the 2017 wildfire season before going into historic wildfire trends, wildfire responsibility areas, and the distribution of wildfires by different landowners in California. I'm going to talk about management coordination and the Northern California wildfires in particular, and then put California in broader context. These are some of the newspaper headlines that we saw over this past year. This was among the most destructive wildfire seasons in California's history. And we saw evacuations of hundreds of thousands of people across the state. As wildfires spread into more urban areas, wildfires in California have traditionally happened on the peripheries of urban centers, but these reached much more urban centers. And as Alyssa and Bruce have both mentioned, the health impacts of wildfires are certainly something that cannot be ignored. And the Thomas Fire, which took place in Southern California at the end of 2017, became the largest in the state's history, which prompted newspaper headlines like this: "The Thomas Fire is terrifying, fire trends are even more terrifying." So if we look at some of these wildfire trends, we can see that the number of wildfires that took place in California between 2002 and 2017 remained fairly constant at about 8,000 wildfires a year. There are some high years and some low years, but the linear regression trend here says that there's about 8,000 a year. There is an increase based on this linear regression trend of 30 wildfires a year, but in the grand scheme of 8,000, that's basically nothing. But if we look at the severity of these wildfires, and by severity I mean number of acres burned, there's a slightly different story. There are, again, high years and low years. 2017 was a particularly high year with 1.2 million acres burned. That's about 1% of the entire state of California was on fire last year. But the trend line here is an increase of 19,000 acres every single year. That's about 2.2% of the average, which is about 800,000 acres. So what we see is that the number of wildfires has remained fairly consistent in California, but the severity of these wildfires is steadily increasing. And if we look at where these wildfires are happening, it's important to think about the different landowners. In California, there are 3 responsibility areas. There's the federal responsibility area, which is highlighted in green. It's about 50% of the state, and it's all the land that's owned by the federal government. There are state responsibility areas, which are highlighted in pink. Those are areas where the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection is responsible. That's CAL FIRE. These are mostly state and private lands. And then there's local responsibility areas, which are highlighted in yellow. And these are areas that are urban centers, they're deserts, they're agricultural centers. They're places where not a lot of wildfires happen. And if we look at a map of where these wildfires happen, most of them happen between 2002 and 2016 is this map. Most of them happen on federal and state responsibility areas, which makes sense. If you're in a local responsibility area, you're probably going to be in a city. There's not a lot of wildfires in downtown Palo Alto where I live. Not very surprising. But if we wanted to take a deeper look, we could also look at the percentage of these wildfires and where they occur by different landowners. So this is the percentage of individual wildfires that take place by different landowners across the state. What this says is that on average, 70% of individual wildfires in California take place on state land, and 20% take place on U.S. Forest Service land. And if you look at these big blue dots and you compare them to where the dots on the next slide are going to be, which is going to be the severity, you'd see that there's a difference here. That the state suddenly drops from 70% of the individual wildfires to about 30% of the total acres burned. And the U.S. Forest Service goes from about 20% of the individual wildfires to about 50% of the total acres burned, which suggests that there's a lot of small wildfires that take place on state property and not that many large wildfires that take place on federal property. And of these federal players, there's obviously the 5 major federal landowners: U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And these 5 landowners own about 48% of California's total property. And they coordinate their wildfire through documents such as the Guidance for Implementation of Federal Wildland Fire Management Policy, in which they have common standards, there are shared goals, there's collaboration. And so these documents are intended to allow these 5 federal firefighting agencies to coordinate effectively. And they're supported by the Department of Defense in times of extreme need, as well as by interagency groups like the National Interagency Fire Center and the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. But if we were to look on the state side, there's really only one player, which is the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And CAL FIRE coordinates with these federal agencies through mutual aid and through shared coordinating processes that allow firefighting funds to be kind of shared across agencies, allowing resources to be shared across federal and state agencies. And while this is an indication of collaboration in paper, it may not be an example of collaboration in practice. So in 2017, in July, California Office of Emergency Services told the U.S. Forest Service that if it didn't pay back $18 million in mutual aid from firefighting resources, then California would no longer support U.S. Forest Service funding, or would no longer support U.S. Forest Service firefighting. About $14 million of that was paid back at least, but there's about a 2-month period in which mutual aid is due. In 2016, 90% of those mutual aid payments went late, and the previous year it was 2/3. So it may not always work out as well in practice. And if we look at the local governments, oops, that's the wrong direction. The local governments are supported by their local fire departments. So if you think about your town's local fire department, that's who's participating on these local responsibility areas. And these local responsibility areas and CAL FIRE coordinate Again, fairly effectively on paper, but perhaps not as effectively in practice. And so if we were to look at the Northern California wildfires, and particularly the Tubbs fire, there are coordinating efforts for mutual aid between the local government and the state government, and about between 2/3 and 70% of mutual aid requests from the state government to the local government are filled, which is great. But there's thousands of requests from local agencies to the state that have gone unfulfilled. So in 2015, there were almost 1,000 unfulfilled requests for mutual aid from the local agencies to the state. And in 2016, that was 3,000 unfulfilled requests. And within the first couple of hours of the October 2017 wildfires, which again were among the most destructive the state's ever had, there were 175 unfulfilled requests within those first few hours. And this map shows where some of this mutual aid was sent to the Tubbs fire, which certainly helped. But if you think about combating wildfires, those first couple of hours are incredibly important, and to not get that aid early was incredibly destructive. And last month, local fire officials requested $100 million to support the mutual aid system in California. I don't know whether $100 million is going to be enough to cover those needs, but if you think about the fact that the California state was willing to not help the U.S. Forest Service over $18 million, $100 million is certainly an improvement over that. But I want to mention that this is a real California, the story that I'm telling. And it may not necessarily be true if we're going to look at other states in the West. So the graph that I'd shown earlier about where wildfires happen by landowner, this is the California side, and I can compare it to the Washington side. And the graphs look fairly similar. U.S. Forest Service is about 20%, bulk is on the state side. But if we look at where acres are burned by landowner, we see that there's a difference here. And if we compare California to the 13 western states, in terms of where wildfires actually occur individually, we see that there's a pretty big difference in terms of these landowners. And the same is true for the severity of these acres burned. And so what I'd like to conclude with is that the number of wildfires in an area does not equate to the severity of the wildfires in those areas. Collaboration is complicated. It involves many players, many stakeholders with different priorities. I talked here about wildfire suppression, but wildfire prevention is similarly complicated. And California may not be representative of the West overall, but there are certainly lessons that we can learn from California, and that I hope will be useful here at the Rural West Conference. And with that, thank you very much.
All right, does this work? Morning, everyone. My name's John Giller. I'm recently appointed, as was mentioned here, as the Director for Fire Fuels and Aviation for the Pacific Northwest and Alaska regions. So that's all Oregon, Washington, and Alaska with the U.S. Forest Service. And then, like was mentioned also, we're a Service First organization here in the Northwest. So I'm also the Director for the BLM lands in Oregon and Washington. So a big job, a lot of firefighters that work with us. When I thought about how I should present this, I kind of figured that there would be some folks that really understand the land portion of this. I'm going to talk to you about this from the firefighter perspective. I've done firefighting for 37 years now. I've been on incident management teams for 23 years. I'm a Type 1 incident commander, a Type 1 operations section chief. So that's my lens, and that's how I look at this problem. So first, what is a wildland firefighter? That's a real hard thing to say. Wildland firefighters are everything from, the basic ones you think of as the Forest Service or the CAL FIRE, those kind of folks. Then there's also, those volunteers with the fire departments. There's militia folks, or folks that work in silviculture, timber, or whatever, that come out and fight fire. So putting a pinpoint on the actual who's a firefighter, wildland firefighter, is really tough. Even structure fire department guys come out and work on wildland fires. But the number that we use, and almost all the numbers I'm going to give you are just real general. Please don't hold me to them. They're just real general numbers. So roughly what we talk about is about 30,000 wildland firefighters in the United States. About 10,000 of those are from the Pacific Northwest. And one of the main reasons why is because we have a lot of contractors in the Northwest here. The contractor associations are big and viable, very strong, and those folks provide a lot of firefighters to the United States. So state, local, federal contractors all together is what I'm talking about. Just to put things in context here, United States Forest Service is the largest fire department in the world. We have more firefighters, more equipment, more apparatus, more aircraft than anyone else in the world. Within the Northwest, the firefighters that I lead, there's about I'm talking just firefighters, not the support people and other folks in the background, the militia. About 2,000 Forest Service firefighters, about 400 of them that are BLM. So of those 30,000 wildland firefighters roughly, and again, this is real rough because we don't really know who a wildland firefighter is, over the last 50 years or so, the statistics have been pretty similar, pretty consistent. We kill about 17 wildland firefighters a year. When you think about the numbers there, 17 firefighters per a population of 30,000, that's the number that we kill per year. If any other industry had those kind of numbers, I think we'd all be in an uproar. It's one of the most dangerous jobs in the United States, and I don't think we often recognize that. I do a lot of work back east. I used to work for the Washington office, and I go to the Emmetsburg, the National Fallen Firefighters Memorial there. And I can look on those plaques for all the years of the fallen firefighters, and there's a bunch of them that are wildland firefighters. There's a bunch of those folks that I know that were my friends, that their names that I recognize, they're people that I know. So that tells me that, it's significant. It's not just folks out there in the woods fighting fire. So these folks that are firefighters are the young men and women, mostly from rural communities. They're usually in small towns and in rural places. As far as individuals, they're usually in the top 10% of the physical fitness of the population. These are hardworking folks that are working long hours. They love being outdoors. They love doing what they do. That's why I've done this job as long as I have. One of the other things that inspires me about them is they're public servants that are about the greater good. They're not doing this for their own. They're not doing this to get rich. The average firefighter the actual firefighter makes about $15 an hour in the Forest Service of the BLM. The leadership makes about $20 an hour. They do work a lot of overtime, but sometimes too much overtime. On fires through the summer, they're sleeping in tents. They're working 16 hours a day. They're working in arduous, dangerous conditions. They can spend weeks, sometimes months away from home every summer. Some of the Hotshot Crews, and those are our elite firefighters like special forces in the military or something. Recent years here, some of those crews have gotten 2,000 hours of overtime in one summer. That's a year's worth of work, of overtime in one summer in 3, 4, 5 months. The amount of work that those guys are doing and the dangers that they're in are kind of unprecedented, and I just hope to make folks realize that. So wildland firefighters in the U.S., I'm going to give you some stats here. 6.2 million acres roughly per year, last 10 years. Last couple big seasons of 2015, 2017, we burned about 10 million acres. Roughly 1.1 million acres in Oregon, Washington. 3,300 fires is the number of fires that we had in 2017. 44% were human-caused in Oregon, 91% in Washington. Would cause you to think that maybe some prevention could work in Washington. Throughout history of firefighting, we've had, for the longest time, 50 years or so, 97, 98% success rate. We put out 97, 98% of the fires that start at initial attack. They don't burn into the next day. We put them out. But the 2 to 3% that get away from us are the ones that cause all the damage. They're the ones that make the news. They're the ones that we hear about all the time. 11,500 structures were burned in 2017. Not enough structures to really make a difference. I think that insurance companies and those kind of folks are really looking at this as a big problem. One hailstorm coming through a city is a lot more money than that. 80 plus citizens died due to wildfire in 2017. So one of the things that was mentioned here was the climate change, and it's definitely changing. There's no doubt about it. Since I've started my career, things have changed quite a bit. Fires are burning year-round now. Some of the fires that were in California burned right through Christmas into the next year. So now we're starting to call fire seasons fire years. There's really no season anymore. There's fires burning right now in Southeast and in Arizona. A lot of this is due to 10 a.m. policy from 1935. You know, we've been putting out fires for a long, long time. Fires are a natural thing. They're as natural as thunderstorm, they're as natural as rain. But we seem to think for some reason that we're going to come out there and we're going to change that, and we're going to put these fires out, and that's something we can control. So that kind of a mindset has caused us to be in a situation that we are now, and I think it's culminated quite a bit in just the recent years here. So there's about 40 plus land management units in the Northwest. That's for all the agencies that were talked about up there, and then the state lands. All but 2 of those, 38 of them, have had their top 3 largest wildfires in the last 7 years. And a lot of them have had all 3 of their top 3 fires in the last 7 years. So things are changing there. 60 million acres of high fire hazard is what's kind of talked about in the United States. Those are areas that are uncharacteristically susceptible to wildfire. When I look at it, when I think about my years of going around looking at wildfires and landscapes, we're not going to burn our way out of that problem. We're not going to log our way out of that problem. One of the things that I think what we need to do is focus on where those high priority values are and focus those treatments on those kind of places. Talked about some of the fires that burn in areas and how come you know the resources or the acres burned down on the private lands are not as much. I'll be honest with you, it's because that's what we prioritize to put the resources on. We send the firefighters to protect the private lands. We send the firefighters to protect the homes, the private property, the people's livelihoods. And so we're letting those fires go in the forest because we're sending the resources down to where the highest priorities are, which is how it should be. I don't have a lot of time here, so you know there's a lot of things that we're doing to try to get a hold of these things. The Cohesive Wild Strategy, working with our partners and collaborators, working all together to see, like was mentioned, fire knows no boundaries. But the one thing I'd like to mention is that not all fire is bad fire. Fire's a good thing. And I'm a firefighter, and I'm telling you this. And I'll give you an example. The Eagle Creek fire down here in the Columbia Gorge here. If you listen to the news, you'd think that was the most horrible thing in the world. We burned up devastation and disaster and everything else, all the D words. When you look at it actually on the ground, based on burn severity, only 16% of that fire was high severity. 30% of it was high severity based on vegetation, meaning 75% or more of the overstory was removed. Chetco Bar Fire, one of the largest fires in the Northwest here, only 6% of that was high severity based on soil, and 37% based on vegetation. So when I look at that, then the other 63% or whatever did some good. It thinned out the trees, it reduced the fire hazard, it allowed fire to do its ecological work that it needs to do. So the message there is, how do we get that nuanced story out to the public? How do we stop saying that every single acre out there is devastated? How do we stop saying that we need more firefighters and we need more money and we got to throw more stuff at these fires? That's what we've been doing all my career. We got bigger firefighters. We got 10,000 gallon, 20,000 gallon air tankers now. We're not doing any better. Fires are just getting just as big. They're burning just as severe, and we're killing just as many firefighters. So something's got to change. We can't keep doing the same thing. To me, Mother Nature is self-correcting the mess that we created. I think some people don't want to hear that, but that's the fact of the matter. If we weren't here, Wildland Fire would clean this place all up and we'd be in fine shape again. People are what's making this a difficult situation. It's the homes, it's the people, it's the complaints about smoke. So I'll just summarize here a few things. Protecting public safety, I know, is important to everyone in rural West, and I'll tell you there, most important things we can do is have plans in place before a fire ever starts. Local notifications, evacuations, defensible space. Those are the key things to protect public. Protecting property and resource value is the collaboration, strategic placement of hazardous fuels treatments, preparations by land managers. Smoke and tourism impacts, and I know those are big, but my go-to answer with that is welcome to the West. It's been burning for centuries, and why do you think we should stop now? Because you moved here. Public health. Center for Disease Control says that 85% of people spend 85% of their life indoors. We can't filter the outdoor air, but we can filter indoor air. There's good filter systems that work. If we have populations that are sensitive to smoke, well, let's provide those areas where they can go to breathe fresh air. Let's provide the filters so that their homes can be safe. Focus our efforts on high values, minimize firefighter exposure, educate the public. Public defines what success is. We used to think it was putting out fires. We used to think it was minimizing the number of homes that were burned. We can do all those things, and if we don't get the message right to the public, they're still going to say that you guys failed. That's what we run into. So thank you. Appreciate being here.
All right. I wanted to answer Bruce's question. Bruce's question was about how we get better coordination in government. That only happens if there's a crisis, and money. And the way we fund our wildland firefighting operation is abysmal. We need to have a fund that is like FEMA. It's available and predictable, both at the local, county, and state level. And then there needs to be a czar, if you will, of firefighting, so that when the resources in Santa Rosa are not sufficient to meet the fire, there can be an order to move that equipment, both military and civilian, to deal with the fire. I was saying I was on the Gore Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, and I went to Lloyd's of London to find out how they insured aircraft. And they said, oh, we do it the same. So if you fly from Seattle to Yakima, the 737 or the F-27 is insured the same as if you're flying into Pakistan or if you're flying into Algeria, where there is a much higher risk. We need to make sure that the insurance companies are reflecting what the actual danger is for these million-dollar homes that are being built. And when they're being built, there's absolutely no consideration or requirement that they have some kind of fire perimeter around them. So instead, we expect the firefighters to go in and risk their life because some person has built the home, has been paying underinsurance rather than the proper insurance, and not taken the structural approach that would be necessary to protect that home. I also want to talk, every fire is a result, in my judgment, of not having done good research on how a fire could have been prevented. When I was director of the BLM, I found out that we waited until the fire season to buy the seed and the other materials we would use for restoration. So not predictably, the Chicago market, where most of the seed was purchased, would have a spike in prices when the dear federal government came in, whether it was the Forest Service or BLM, to buy the seed necessary to do rehab or restoration. And then inevitably there would be some non-native species used in the area. In northern Arizona, for instance, they put in Kentucky bluegrass, and predictably 3 years later there was another fire because they had planted the wrong seed. So one of the fundamental things we need to be doing is about how to research the restoration and rehab process. Now, I'm sure John knows the distinction between rehab and restoration because it relates to funding. If a local fire community can call it rehab, then the federal government pays for it. And so, for instance, in Boise in 2008, there was the 8th Avenue fire, and they spent several $millions putting in new grass barriers in the foothills to avoid the erosion problems that are now hitting Southern California. That was paid by the federal government. However, if it's called restoration, then the obligation falls at the state or local level, and the funding mechanism is simply not there. And it's that kind of restoration work that's not only going to protect the wildland firefighters in the future, but it also will have a longer lasting effect in a positive ecological sense. So we ought to be doing, fundamental research about how the restoration process or the rehab process, because in my mind they're one and the same. But for the bean counters in Washington or at their counterparts in the state, there is an accounting difference that goes on. We also need to in my judgment, have a greater awareness on the part of the public about how fire is part of the natural landscape. If you look at the Yellowstone fire, and I was there shortly after the fire, and again, this is something that John may not have mentioned, but should be mentioned. A friend of mine who was a Vietnam combat veteran was a television news cameraman, and he was at Old Faithful when the fire came there, and he said in Vietnam he had never been faced with the same kind of frightening experience. How many in the audience have ever seen a wildland fire within a mile or so? The thing that's amazing to me is the speed with which it can move. And in Yellowstone, this fire was moving at 60 to 70 miles an hour based on the wind that was behind it. And he said there was this incredible roar like a locomotive, and then all of a sudden it burst into a 120-foot high wall of flames. So it really is an amazing phenomena. But again, it is something that has some basis in science that if we knew, we could do something about. Now, in Pat Shea's world, which my wife tells me sometimes is a bit of a fantasy land, when all of our resources that we've spent in Iraq and Afghanistan come back to the United States, we are going to have better technology, including drones, that will lessen the danger possibly to firefighters if we're willing to use them. But we also, using GIS, ought to have a map with several different layers that would show a firefighter on the way to the fire what was the past history of the area, what was the topography, what was the hydrological history of that area, and therefore have a battle plan on how to deal with it, and to make a decision about whether you're going to let it burn or you're going to try to control it. And if you're going to control it, prior to going there, if there are houses or other private properties, they would have been prioritized in a way in which the firefighter is able to make a decision that she can then allocate resources necessary to work that way. Now, in urban areas, now in most cities, as a fire crew is responding to a fire, they can tell on their computer screen in the cabin of the fire truck the structure, how many people live there, and that kind of detail that then allows them to allocate resources. In Utah, we began doing a history of the different fires that go on, and Santa Rosa is a great example. The fire that my brother-in-law and sister-in-law lost their house in, where they had 10 minutes to get out of the house, had its predecessor in 1963. Same fire pattern, and indeed the same weather conditions. So we get all our weather reports with greater detail, so why not be able to have a fire report that allows the civilian population and certainly the firefighters to have a more predictable process. The question is money. Are we willing, particularly in the era of climate change being recognized, and I should say as a proud father, my son works for HEAL Utah, which is an environmental organization, and for the first time in Utah's history, the Utah legislature, the most read legislature in the country, passed a resolution recognizing climate change. So, by God, if Utah can do it, the rest of the country is going to be moving on forward to have a more scientific-based decision-making process. But the one thing I hope that you would take away from the conference today is when you get back to your community, go visit your local firefighting office or organization and see what preparations they have for that wildland-urban interface. And I think you'll be surprised and probably disappointed that there hasn't been a lot of thought about it, because firefighting is still seen by most local or county organizations as a spontaneous emergency, where in fact there is a high degree of predictability when you're talking about wildland fires. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate your technological help. An amazing thing has occurred. A panel with 3 academics actually finished 8 minutes before it was supposed to, so that leaves us a lot of time for questions. So we'll turn it over for questions at this point. Do we want to pass the microphone around, or?
I turned my mic on, so it
Okay.
now works.
So, do I just toss, I could just toss this in general direct? No, you don't, okay, you don't like that, all right. Okay. So questions?
So I want to thank everybody. Those were fascinating presentations, and having been on Alaska and spent a long time at the Seattle airport yesterday, I heard every flight board and military were boarded first, and they said thank you for your service. So before I do anything else, I want to thank John for his service and have him pass that on to all the people he works with. I've been interested in the issue of the wildland-urban interface for some years, and I've done some writing about it. And a study just came out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Academics here are going to whinge when I say that I'd like to read the first 2 lines of the first 2 sentences of the summary, but they are important before I direct a question to Alyssa and everybody else. This is the rapid growth of the U.S. wildland-urban interface raises wildfire risk. Doesn't surprise anybody having heard this panel. The significance: first, there will be more wildfires due to human ignitions. Second, wildfires that occur will pose a greater risk to lives and homes, I'd add to firefighters. They will be harder to fight, and letting natural fires burn becomes impossible. Bruce talked at the beginning about collaboration and working with local governments. Pat talked about insurance reflecting actual risk. Alyssa, how much local governments love new development, they love the tax revenues, they, particularly in the West, are ideologically highly resistant to controlling local development. Faced with the fire risk in the wildland-urban interface, faced with in the last 30 years, some 25% increase in development in the WUI, what can be done to encourage local governments as well as insurance companies to control this development and to recognize what it costs in land and in lives?
It's a great question. So I think that one, I totally agree with you that it's very difficult in the rural West, where folks are highly resistant to being told what to do. A lot of them have moved to these places because precisely they don't want to be told what to do, especially by the government. It's very challenging. In Central Oregon, 2 areas where we've seen progress, I guess, as potential avenues forward. One is it's much easier to require either building code changes, community development codes, things like the NFPA's WUI code to be built into new developments. So Bend actually went through a process of trying to expand their urban growth boundary in 2016. And they put forward a proposal, and as part of that proposal, there was a long discussion about to what extent should wildland-urban interface design be part of the urban growth boundary expansion. So maybe we can't do it with places that are already developed, but maybe as cities expand their boundaries, pushing likely into the WUI, closer to forested or rangeland areas, that becomes a place where at least it's a new regulation that is applying to new development as opposed to regulation applying retroactively. That's an easier pill to swallow for rural communities. And in fact, there are at least 2 major developments on the west side of Bend that literally their backyard is the national forest that will be implementing, I think it's the NFPA's WUI code. I might have there are a couple different competing WUI codes, but things like greater defensible space around homes, things like building roads, instead of having the home back up to the national forest, have a common area or green space or a road back up to the national forest to create that buffer. And then things like better ingress and egress, better access for firefighters in the case of fire. So I think the expansion of cities or towns is a place for opportunity. And another place for opportunity where we have seen success, again in Central Oregon, is through homeowners associations responding to high levels of wildfire threat that threaten their communities. So in the 70s, places like Black Butte Ranch and Sun River, these very high-value resort communities, actually required wood shake roofs, which are incredibly flammable. They changed those requirements after some severe wildfires either made it into their communities or threatened their communities. And now, particularly a place like Sun River, which I should say has very high homeowners association fees and thus has a very robust internal regulatory structure. Sun River does incredible amounts of thinning every year. They maintain their common spaces. And so that is a way to, the homeowners association is a way potentially to bypass some of those municipal regulatory concerns that can be very difficult to implement. A very important caveat, though, is that there's a tremendous amount of inequality between between communities that have homeowners associations. So Sun River is nothing like, Deschutes River Woods area where you have half-acre or one-acre plots and a lot of, for example, double-wide trailer homes on those lands. There's a lot of economic inequality that really does impact communities' ability to engage in mitigation efforts. And we know that socioeconomics are tightly correlated with trust in government, ability to accept regulation. So complicated, two potential avenues forward, but those are still very limited.
I wanted to turn it over to Pat. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like
Pat.
to, at BLM, we had a budget when I was there 20 years ago of $2.8 billion, of which $800 million was for payment in lieu of taxes, or PILT, which went directly to counties that had large areas of federal land because they weren't getting property taxes. I think in this day and age of too many T words, the one we need to revisit is tax. We need to be able to come up with funding through a federal tax policy that gets federal dollars to local areas that have natural resources that, whether it's for tourism or just open space, needs to be subsidized. So that the local communities do have adequate funding for both firefighting and for schools and for healthcare. And then we're going to have a sea change in order to do that.
I wanted to I thank you for all the good news stories. I was just wondering if anybody on the panel, Rebecca or John or Pat could tell us about bad news stories, communities that have refused to do any control or that have told insurance companies they can't charge the higher rates.
Welcome to Utah. I say that with affection, but also they keep talking, the Bundys of the world, about how they would be better land managers, including fire. So they point their finger at the Forest Service and they see how many fires we've had, and they do not do the analysis of why those fires have occurred or what it would take to avoid them in the future.
So California has a hazard mapping system and a model, which puts out moderate, high, and what are called very high fire hazard severity zones. And California's government code mandates that very high fire hazard severity zones, which generally speaking are the WUI, they're just in the local responsibility areas that I had mentioned in my presentation, that you have to have about 100 feet of defensible space as a buffer zone between the forest and the building. Of the 188 local responsibility area communities in California with very high fire hazard severity zones, it is unknown how many of them actually do this 100 feet defensible space buffer. Because California Government Code 51179B, if you want to look that up, allows communities to opt out of classifying themselves as very high fire hazard severity zones. And CAL FIRE does not keep track of which communities opted out or opted in. And there's no record of which communities are doing either. And this is in the California State Legislative Code, that this loophole exists. So
If you had the data, it would strike me that that data would tell you that it depends who's doing it, depends on how wealthy the community is. Communities that people don't have money, they don't do that.
So I'm in the process of identifying which of these 188 communities fall into these different buckets. And it's hard to determine. In some cases, communities have opted out but are doing the defensible space requirements that CAL FIRE mandates, but are calling it something different, or are excluding themselves because of insurance concerns or tax concerns, or worries that people won't actually move to the community because it's a very high fire hazard severity zone. And so the ramifications of this are unknown, partially because nobody even knows which one of these communities fall into which bucket.
So you'll have an answer for us in a year or two.
When I graduate.
Right.
Well, we're just, the Bill Lane Center is indulging itself right now. Apologies. This is a quick question. I think California had a tax that was assessed to rural communities to help pay for fire prevention or mitigation. And there was a lawsuit that said that was an unfair burden on rural taxpayers. And I don't recall where that ended up and what's the story with that.
I don't know.
Neither do I.
I'll look.
Great question. You stumped the entire panel.
Maybe I just made it up. Fake news. You can always get a scoop.
Okay, we need a question that we can answer, or they can answer. Bruce, make this good.
To the rescue. I only ask those questions. I want to ask John about something that I didn't quite understand in your presentation, which was excellent, but I didn't understand. One of your themes is what we heard last year at our New Mexico Rural West, which is the desire to let these fires burn in order to clean out the forests, which was characterized last year by the speaker, who was kind of a colorful guy, as burn baby burn. That was his philosophy. And I'm trying to understand, because I think there was another theme which is actually very consistent with something that's going on with sea level rise, which is in sea level rise there's resist the water and there's live with the water. These are the two schools that are developing. And we now, and I heard in yours, the comparable thing, which is resist the fires, live with the fires. And that's the notion of having the filtering systems and taking vulnerable communities and protecting them, and perhaps some progress in not letting people live in areas they shouldn't live in, which is kind of where Rebecca's focusing on. But it seemed to me I couldn't quite understand where you were, though, on managed or controlled burns or prescribed burns or whatever. So are you of the view that it's burn baby burn and just protect vulnerable populations, or in an ideal world, does managed and prescribed burn have a role as well? And if so, what is that role, and where do you do the managed and prescribed burns, and where do you do burn baby burn?
Sure. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That was part of what I wanted to talk about when I didn't have enough time. So there's some science that we have. We've done similar to what California has. We know where those high critical value areas are, where fires are most likely to impact those values and such. So that to us at the regional scale, that's where we want to focus our funds. That's where we want to focus our treatments. Places where the limited amount of money we have, we can invest in and get the most bang for the buck. When I talk about fires that we are letting burn for other, however it's quoted, let me give you an example. 2015, we had some of the largest wildfires in the Northwest ever. The north central Washington area, we had huge fires, some of the biggest fires we've ever had. And we got to the point where we ran out of firefighters. It was just plain and clear. We did not have enough firefighters to go put those fires out. So by default, what we ended up doing is we focused all of our crews down where we're protecting private lands, we're protecting communities, And that stuff that went up into the mountains and up into the wilderness, fire perimeters that we would normally have controlled in the past, we didn't have firefighters to put on those fires. At one point in the summer, there was over 1,000 miles of unstaffed fire line. At the end of the year, when the rains and the snows came, not a single boot ever hit the ground on that 1,000 plus miles of perimeter. All those fires went out. Not all those fires caused that much damage, going back to the statistics that I'm talking about. So when I say we need to manage wildfire and use that, it's just that that's where we already have the Air Force in place. I've got the Army in place. If fire is going to threaten the community or whatever, I've got a fire camp here with a whole lot of firefighters, and you know what? We'll go get that piece of that before it gets down into the communities. Once we staff a fire, we're pretty good at protecting communities and protecting homes. Fires don't escape from us and go burn down another community very rarely. That just doesn't happen. So if we have an opportunity while we're there, protecting all those communities and such, and then letting the good fire do the good stuff in the back hills, that to me is a win-win situation. Doing the preparations beforehand, before a fire ever comes though, is where the other part where we can really leverage the limited amount of money that we have. So I'm new to this job and I have a lot of ideas, a lot of vision. One of the things that I would like to see happen before I'm out of my career is every forest, every district BLM district has a plan in place and has already thought about those wildfires that are going to occur on their unit. It's obvious they're going to occur. We know where they're going to occur. And I, as an ops chief, and every other ops chief that I know where the hell I'm going to stop that fire if it ever comes. That FMO that manages that area knows those areas that I need to prep these roads. This is this ridge we're going to use. It's this big old burn scar here that we're going to tie into. If we already know that, then how come we don't do those treatments before the fire ever happens? That's the whole key to success here. That's where we can focus the limited amount of funds that we have on the key areas where we can do the most good and we can prepare that for that fire that's eventually going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We're in a fire-adapted ecological system here. We just got to be prepared for it.
Yeah, one of the other Shea pipe dreams is to have a national service requirement. So everybody between the ages of 18 and 30 would have spent a year or perhaps 2 years doing national service like the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Imagine the difference there would be in the social fiber of our country if everybody had had some experience of working on the infrastructure, as John was talking about, at the local BLM or Forest Service level, doing the kind of work necessary prior to a fire season.
One thing to add would be, it appears that we're still staffing, because most of the 10,000 10 or 20,000 firefighters that we have, whatever that number is, most of them are seasonal employees working for maybe 6 months out of the year, when really this is a year-round problem, and especially doing a lot of the prevention work that folks are talking about requires work in the off-season. You don't want to do a prescribed fire in August. You want to do a prescribed fire right before the snows come. And so shifting the way that especially federal agencies are able to staff their firefighting resources could go a long way to doing some of those ahead of season prevention things. And then of course comes down to issues of funding.
So let me just ask one other question here. So there are two sort of uncertainties here that change things in the future. One is the climate change itself, which leads to the single fire season phenomena. That is, you don't get those snows that stop the uncontrolled burns in the past. So now you potentially could have a fire that goes some, 40 or 50 years from now if in fact we have climate warming, there aren't the snows, potentially the fires could continue longer, right? And then the other uncertainty is the continued growth in the amenity west, that is, people continuing to want to live in these areas. And if the policy is to protect those areas first and foremost and let the other areas burn, then you're creating an incentive for more growth in these areas, which sort of distorts the system further. So I'm worried about the future given the policies that we have right now. Tell me that I shouldn't be worried.
I think you're right in worrying. I'm just being honest. You know, I'll give you an example here. The Oregon Fire Summit that we had about 2 weeks ago or so, and Governor Kate Brown was there and some other folks, and really a whole room of PhDs that were talking about all these different things that we're doing to protect communities and such. The most poignant point to me in that meeting was that a guy from the tribes stood up, and I can't remember which tribe, and he says, you know, to us tribal folks, it seems like we're using MIT mathematicians to solve a 2 + 2 problem. To them, this is not complicated. Throughout history, through thousands of years, Indians used prescribed fire. They lit the landscape. When they got done in the fall, they lit their areas where they camped all summer and they burned it all off. They never put out a fire. All those fires up in the hills, they let them go. They knew they were doing the right thing. God did that, that's okay, we're gonna let that go. And so we, as a society, have come to the point where we've forgotten where we've come from, and we forgot that there's value in fire. Yes, to me, we need to do prescribed fire right around communities, and that's probably the most important place that we could do prescribed fire. But it goes back to the argument of folks don't want to eat the smoke. Even our own Oregon Department of Forestry in Oregon are the biggest ones that's the biggest hurdle we have. If someone on a phone in a community picks up a phone and says, yeah, the smoke's coming in here and I just don't like it, that's an intrusion. I have to stop the burning. Okay, so then in the summer when the wildfire happens, they kind of wonder why we didn't do something more to protect that. Well, it's all a big cycle of we got to work together on this, and that's where the public education part comes in. I want to say one more thing before we get off of this, and it's about California. And I hope you guys realize that it's the big part of the problem nationally. 57% of the Forest Service budget is fire. Half of that goes to California. We spend so much money on those fires, like the Thomas Fire and those other ones, that it is just an amazing amount of money. All the other fires that we have across the United States put together don't come close to what we spend just in California. And that's not the majority of the population. That's just where we have the majority of the problem.
So I have a question for the panelists. We live and farm where the Taylor Bridge fire happened a few years ago, and the Jolly Mountain came up close to us this year. And a big distinction between those two events was the communications, and it was highly professionalized this year. And it may have been a little late coming to the neighborhood, but it was really good when it arrived. And it was meteorologists, and it was the professional, the team, Larry Leach from DNR got up every day, or it was every week. And I'm wondering, in the theme of collaboration and cooperation of this topic area today, if maybe there's some better outreach and communications that can happen all year. Can we tap into the academic world? Can we tap into journalism and tell stories before? And they can be about, get your filters, have your house prepared, do your fire breaks, understand what it means in your community when fire comes and an entire thousands of people show up. Be prepared for what's happening. And I think it's one of the areas of collaboration that we could actually be exploring better, and especially with the research that's going on that you all are doing. So I'd love to know what you think about that and how it might happen. And it probably requires funding, but it's not as expensive as some of the other prescriptions you're putting forward.
I'll defer to Lisa. You'll defer. It's a social problem.
Absolutely, and I think that some of the areas, so for example, folks who are working on the Deschutes National Forest have told me that public acceptance of smoke from prescribed fire has gone way up in recent years. People, not only is this a very fire-tested community with a lot of fire history, so they perhaps understand the problem quite well, but there are several organizations right in that Central Oregon region, Project Wildfire and then the Deschutes Forest Collaborative Project, that are engaging in precisely that type of off-season communication. So the Deschutes Collaborative in particular, and you might have a better sense of what the funding source is. I think it comes from the Forest Service indirectly to these organizations, and they work indirectly with the Forest Service. So all kinds of funding workarounds there. But they do things like they partner with local breweries to have coasters about fire prevention, or they'll make very high quality 2-minute videos that will actually, or I guess they're shorter than 2 minutes, that will be some of those previews when you go to the movie theater, and they'll be all about smoke from prescribed fire. So there are examples. Up here in Washington, there is an organization called the Chumstick Coalition that has been working on outreach, and there's another organization that whose name is slipping my mind, but I can find it and look it up for you. So there are folks who are really thinking about this, and I think the funding and the public support aren't always there, but absolutely the communication is really important.
So when we had our Pulitzer Prize, when the I think it was one of the journalistic prizes went to the series of articles about the earthquakes, and that has educated, and so it might even take that kind of level of just quality messaging.
Yeah. One thing in Utah, in the 4th and 9th grade, students are required to take a course on water. And it would seem to me in those areas where there are potential for significant wildfires, kids lead the way. If a child, when they're 10 or they're 14, learn about wildfires, they're going to go home and talk to their parents and grandparents. And so I would check with your local schools to see if the curriculum includes some discussion about wildfires.
Oh, we have a couple of questions over there, and I'm going to abuse my power as a mic holder for a second to circle back to the question I had before, just to give you some background. During the budget crisis in 2011, well, I'm sure there was an earlier crisis than that, but California passed a fire prevention fee that charged rural houses $153 per habitable structure in brushy and wooded areas at high risk for wildfires. This hit 800,000 rural California properties, and the Republican legislators were so against it that they worked with the Howard Jarvis taxpayers group to fight it, and in a deal related to the cap and trade bill, the California legislature voted to rescind it. But by then they'd raised $200 million from it, and now Howard Jarvis is trying to get $300 million back from the state.
All the way back in the corner.
We very often think about this as all a forest issue, but it's also a rangeland issue. And I have a friend in central Washington who, 6,000 acre cattle ranch, lost 5,500 acres of rangeland, privately owned rangeland, because a Forest Service crew on the scene would not let her and her neighbor build a fire line. You might as well have set her business on fire. I mean, that was setting her business on fire. Just picture setting fires along any shopping mall. She's working with the state of Washington to try to educate people that rangeland is not empty land, it has value too. So John and I talked about this a little bit at the table. Could you speak a bit to the experience in Oregon, Alyssa, you may have information as well, on the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations and the potential for those to be a way of including, allowing people to take responsibility for their own land in a safe way. And maybe that has some lessons to be learned for forested areas as well, for personal responsibility.
Sure. So in relation to what she's asking, in Oregon there's rangeland protective associations, and so what those are is established essentially by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and that was based on a concept going back to forest protective associations. So there's Douglas, Coos, Klamath, different places where groups of landowners, timber landowners, work together to build their own fire suppression organization and take care of the fire problem that they knew they had. So that concept seemed very normal to just, let's evolve that out to the rangeland. We've got cattle ranch owners there that have got thousands and thousands of acres out in eastern Oregon, and they're the folks that are there. When a fire starts, I've got a lot of BLM units, but it may be an hour or two away before a fire truck ever gets there, and it may just be 1 or 2 trucks. Those ranchers are right there on site. That fire's starting in their backyard. They know that ground better than anyone. And so the idea there is, well, why don't we take some federal excess property, make sure that those folks are trained up, understand how to use that equipment, have the safety equipment they need. Let's get them that equipment. Let's get the fire shelters, the hard hats, the Nomex clothing that they need. Get them some federal excess property and allow them to go ahead and work in coordination with our folks. They're there already. They know the ground. They do a really good job of putting out fire because it's in their best interest to put that fire out. We don't have to pay them. They're there anyways. They're patrolling that ground anyways. And so that's the concept behind those Rangeland Protective Associations. On the BLM side, it's been extremely powerful for us. We make sure that they all have the same frequencies that we have. We give them radios and such so that we can all talk to them, get them on the same page. Just 10 years ago, they weren't. Those were folks out there doing actions on their own, a lot of times not coordinated. We didn't know what they were doing. They're burning out a road or something, and we think that's, anyways, it just gets really complicated. So us working together seems to make a lot of sense. Our frustration here is Washington does not have the policies in place at the state level to allow rangeland protective associations to be in place. And so there's the folks in Washington DNR and at the state level, Commissioner Lands, Hillary Franz, they know about this problem. They're working on it. They've got some ideas. One of the things, there was about a month ago, the Washington State Wildland Fire Summit, and at that one, Hillary asked us all to build a 20-year strategic plan for how we're going to protect lands in the state of Washington throughout the next 5, 10, 20 years. And that's part of the discussion there for Washington.
Yeah, one thing I would strongly suggest is to go to your local National Guard and ask, as the equipment's being returned from Iraq and Afghanistan, that it have the advanced placement that John was just talking about. You may not be able to use a tank, but certainly some of the trucks and others can be retrofitted to be capable of doing the fire suppression that you were talking about.
Of how that might connect to timberland, perhaps a good comparison there are owners of large timber allotments, and there are many of those up in Washington as well. And a lot of the folks, just like with the RFPAs, they have a tremendous amount of experience. They're deeply invested in protecting their lands, and at least what I've heard from folks is it's predominantly an issue of communication and making sure that strategies and tactics line up so that if the landowner wants to do a backburn, they're not backburning into where other firefighters are. And if there isn't that communication, then you're putting not just timber or rangeland at risk, but you're putting people's lives at risk. And that combined with the knowledge around fire behavior, weather models and predictions that some of the agencies have access to, if we're able to give that information to the locals and allow for that collaboration, but there has to be that communication, or else you really are putting firefighters at risk.
Okay, I would like to make a comment, a compliment about the information that Bruce mentioned before about the natural fire regime that exists in Mexico. Yes, it is true. Most of the time, not a suppression strategy is applied, but it is important to recognize there are two elements. One is diversity in flora and fauna, flora mainly. It's huge biodiversity, so when there is a fire, it's not going to stand and run wild because there are a lot of types at different ages of trees and vegetation, shrubs in Baja California. And the other important element is that there is permitting of harvesting fuel, and it's done most of the time manually. So there is not a build of fuel there that is controlling that fire as well. And yes, funnily enough, now the federal government is trying to implement suppression of fires in our mountains, and most of us are really worried. Thank you.
I might have missed any comments on this, but any thoughts about the role of the utility industry and the grid and where it's at, what the role of fire protection and fire suppression is? Because it's certainly became a major issue in California this year of whether they're valid or not. It's a private sector industry that has to step up and take their roles and responsibilities.
In the Northwest, it hasn't been a big deal. Mostly when I talk about power line stuff, the folks I'm talking to are BPA, but in California, I know it's a huge issue. In the Spokane area, when we had the big Spokane fires, I don't know, it was about 10 years ago or so, there was a lot of power lines that came down and started a lot of fires, but not much came of that. We didn't really evolve any policies or such from that. But
This is definitely something that I'd like to incorporate into my research, particularly with PG&E and the Tubbs fires and the other Northern California fires, but it's not one that I have yet. So stay tuned.
Can I,
There, two short stories. I did counterterrorism stuff for 6 years. My favorite story was there was a hijacking out of Omaha, Nebraska. 737 lands in Atlanta, which is one of the airports that had a special tunnel that allowed you to breach the fuselage of the plane. The FBI and the FAA argued for 7.5 hours as to who was in charge before they breached the fuselage. In Utah, we had a fire in Red Butte Canyon. Forest Service, Salt Lake County Fire, and Salt Lake City Fire arrived at the scene. They argued for 20 minutes as to who was going to be the fire boss. So we need to have, and I think John's organization and the regional kind of nature is beginning to deal with that, but I would suspect, and I'd be interested in your comment, that they don't have problems at the federal level because there's pretty clear-cut chain of command. It's when you get to the local level, as you did in Santa Rosa, that then the fire bosses begin to say, I'm in charge, I'm in charge.
Okay, last question. Yep. Wait.
So last summer, we lived through really intense smoke from a forest fire that was just west of us. I have a friend who measures their quality, and literally at the end of August, it was off the charts. So my question is pretty specific. Have there been long-term studies of the impact of smoke on the firefighters?
On the firefighters? Yes. We have, there's things called dosimeters and little things that we pin on the firefighters, and it would actually, over a shift, would determine how much amount of smoke those firefighters are inhaling and such. But I'll be honest with you, we try really hard to not let the firefighters stay in the smoke. So even though we're right close to the fire, we stay upwind of the fire. Where we do have problems, though, is when we have fire camps down in drainages and basins and such, where smoke just settles in there, and then they're sleeping in that, and they're there for weeks at a time. That's where we do have issues. I would wish that we would do a lot more on that, because we know that there's definitely health issues with that. I know my lungs don't work near as good as they used to when I was younger, and so I was at 9/11 for 30 days, and when the World Trade Center's there, everyone that was there got their lungs checked out and all this stuff, you know, and they did a lot of work, and they found out, oh yeah, you know, there's a lot of cancer here. I don't know if that's the same kind of a problem in wildland fire smoke with the different kind of things that are burning, but it's certainly a concern. I know we've talked about it a lot. Maybe one of you knows something more about it, but I have not heard anything long-term of what really is the answer there.
I'm not aware of any studies actually tracking the firefighters' health. It's a very difficult population to track because they're often seasonal employees. They might do this for 2 years or 35 years, and it's a hard population to track, but I think it would be an area for really excellent future research.
one quick point on that. The San Francisco Fire Department just studied, they have a high percentage of women in the fire service, and the percentage of breast cancer there is off the wall. It's like 10 to 1, the normal population. So in my past life, I was in occupational medicine. Now this is coming back to life, that the rate of exposure and the occupational pollutants that you're exposed to, not only smoke, is excessive, especially when the product of burning is more, they're dealing with petroleum and vinyl chloride stuff.
Anybody have a more cheery note to end on than that? Anyway, I'd like to thank the panel and the audience for a very interesting and interactive session. Thank you very much. Phil, we're not calling on you again.